The oppressive July humidity settled over Havenwood, Ohio, like a thick, wet blanket, trapping the smells of hot asphalt and wilting cornfields. It was a damp, clinging heat that seeped into the bones and refused to leave, much like the economic despair that had gripped the former factory town for the better part of a decade. Inside the Crossroads Diner, a place that always smelled of stale coffee and fryer grease, the windows were fogged with condensation. Clara Evans, a 26-year-old waitress with tired brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail and shadows under her eyes that spoke of too many double shifts, wiped down a Formica countertop with a worn-out rag. She moved with the efficient, mechanical rhythm of someone who couldn't afford to stop. Every motion sent a dull ache through her lower back, but she pushed it aside. Her mind was on the mental ledger that never seemed to balance. Her mother's last dialysis treatment was past due, and the pharmacy had called twice about the cost of a new medication. Then there was Caleb, her teenage brother, who needed new sneakers for school and money for a class trip he pretended not to want because he knew they couldn't afford it. Clara sighed, the sound lost in the hum of a struggling refrigerator, and poured a fresh cup for Old Man Hemlock, a retired farmer who nursed the same coffee for 3 hours every morning. In the farthest corner booth, away from the door and half hidden by the flickering neon sign outside, sat a man who didn't belong in Havenwood. Jack Riley was in his early 30s, with short, military-cropped black hair and a face that looked carved from granite, handsome but weathered by things he refused to speak of. He wore a simple gray hoodie and jeans, an attempt to blend in. But the way his eyes constantly scanned the room, assessing exits, watching hands, tracking movement, gave him away to anyone paying attention. He was on mandatory leave, a Navy SEAL ordered to decompress, though relaxation felt as foreign to him as the surface of the moon. Curled under the table at his feet was Kaiser, a massive German shepherd whose black and tan coat was graying around the muzzle. A ragged, hairless scar ran the length of the dog's snout, a souvenir from an Ide in a desert half a world away. The dog was technically retired, adopted by Jack because neither of them knew how to be civilians on their own. They were a pair of ghosts haunting a town that had forgotten how to live. Clara watched the pair from the corner of her eye. She knew the rule, don't bother the guy in the corner, but she also knew something else. She'd seen the way the dog's ears perked up when the smell of bacon drifted from the kitchen. Glancing around to make sure the cook, a cantankerous man named Earl who counted every slice of tomato, wasn't looking, Clara grabbed a paper napkin. She wrapped 3 crispy pieces of bacon that had accidentally broken during plating inside the paper. With the coffee pot in her other hand, she made her way to the corner booth. "Little more?" she asked softly, her voice raspy with fatigue. Jack looked up, his eyes an intense and surprising blue, assessing her for a millisecond before giving a single, sharp nod. As she poured, she let her hand dip below the table. "Drop this," she whispered, sliding the napkin near Jack's boot. "Don't tell Earl, or he'll take it out of my tips." Kaiser didn't lunge. The old dog looked up at Jack, waiting for permission. Jack gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Kaiser gently took the offering, his tail thumping once against the linoleum floor. For a second, the hardness in Jack's face cracked, revealing something deeply human underneath. "Thanks," he grunted, his voice rough as gravel. "He appreciates it." Clara offered a tired but genuine smile, the first one to reach her eyes all day. "Looks like he earned it." "You both do." She turned back to the counter, unaware that Jack's eyes remained on her, analyzing the worn spots on her sneakers and the slight limp in her left leg. The bell over the door jangled, not a welcoming chime but a harsh, jarring clatter. The diner's atmosphere changed instantly. Conversations died. The scrape of forks on plates stopped. Sheriff Brody Vance walked in, bringing the heat and misery of the outside world in with him. Vance was a man in his 50s whose power had swollen right along with his waistline. His uniform strained over his bulk, and his face was set in a permanent, angry flush. He wasn't just the law in Havenwood. He was the gatekeeper, the judge, and the executioner of the town's dwindling opportunities. Flanked by 2 younger deputies who mirrored his swagger, if not his size, Vance scanned the room with a sneer, his eyes landing on Clara like a predator spotting a wounded doe. He didn't take a table. He strode right to the counter, his heavy boots making ominous thuds on the linoleum. "Coffee, Clara." "Black and fresh," he barked, planting his elbows on the counter, invading her personal space. Clara felt her stomach clench. "Morning, Sheriff," she said, keeping her voice neutral as she reached for a clean mug. "Just made a fresh pot. Be right up." Vance drummed his fingers on the counter, a rhythmic, impatient sound. "Didn't see your signature on those papers, Clara," he said, his voice loud enough for the diner to hear. He was talking about the deed to her family's small plot of farmland on the edge of town. It was the only thing her father had left them, a worthless patch to most, but Vance and his silent partners wanted it for a commercial depot expansion. "I told you, Sheriff," Clara said, her hand trembling slightly as she held the coffee pot. "It's not for sale. It's our home. It's where Caleb grew up." Vance laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Home? You call that dilapidated farmhouse a home? I'm doing you a favor, girl. You're drowning in debt, your mother is draining you dry, and that delinquent brother of yours is going to end up in one of my cells sooner or later. Sell the land. Pay your bills. Get out of this town. It's the only smart move you've got." Clara poured the coffee, the black liquid swirling in the mug. She set it down in front of him, meeting his gaze with a defiance she didn't know she possessed. "We're not selling, and Caleb is a good kid. Please drink your coffee and leave me alone. I have customers." Vance's face darkened, the veins in his neck bulging. He wasn't used to being told no, certainly not by a minimum wage waitress. He felt the eyes of the town on him, felt his authority being challenged. "You listen here, you little thing," he hissed, leaning closer, his breath smelling of stale tobacco and mints. "I'm not asking any more. You're standing in the way of progress. You think you're special? You're nothing. You're a waitress in a dying town, serving bad food to losers." He gestured vaguely around the room, insulting everyone, but his focus was still locked on her. "I can make your life very difficult. I can make sure the health inspector finds rodents in this kitchen. I can make sure your brother gets pulled over every time he rides his bike. Or you can sign the paper." Clara took a step back, her back hitting the prep counter. "No," she said, louder this time. "Get out." The refusal snapped something in Vance. With a vicious snarl, he swung his hand across the counter. "Oops," he mocked. His hand connected with the steaming mug of coffee Clara had just poured. The ceramic didn't break, but it flipped, sending the scalding black liquid cascading over the counter's edge. It splashed directly onto Clara's leg and ankle. The cheap canvas of her sneakers offered no protection. "Ah!" Clara screamed, the pain immediate and searing. She collapsed to the floor, clutching her leg, tears springing to her eyes as the heat blistered her skin. The diner fell dead silent. Even the cook stopped moving. Vance showed no remorse. He looked satisfied. He walked around the counter, looming over her crumpled form. "See what you made me do," he said, his voice dripping with a fake concern that barely masked his cruelty. "Clumsy, just like your old man." Clara tried to scramble away, whimpering, but her back was against the cabinets. Vance bent down, his thick fingers splaying out. "Get up," he ordered. "Stop making a scene." When she didn't move fast enough, he reached to grab her by the hair, intent on hauling her to her feet. "I said, get up." But his hand never reached her. A blur of motion, silent and impossibly fast, crossed the diner. Before Vance's fingers could touch a single strand of Clara's hair, his wrist was intercepted in mid-air. It wasn't a frantic grab. It was an ironclad, calculated lock. Jack Riley stood there, having appeared as if from nowhere. He had made no sound. He stood between Clara and the sheriff, a human wall of muscle and controlled fury. His grip on Vance's wrist was absolute, freezing the bigger man in place. Jack's face was calm, free of the blotchy rage that colored Vance's, which made him infinitely more terrifying. Behind him, near the booth, Kaiser stood at attention. A low rumble started in his chest, vibrating through the floor, ready to tear out a throat on command. But Jack didn't need the dog. He tightened his grip, twisting Vance's arm just enough to force the sheriff onto the balls of his feet to relieve the pressure. "That's enough," Jack said, his voice low, steady, and cold as the bottom of a lake. It wasn't a request. It was an order. The silence in the diner was absolute, broken only by the sharp intake of breath from the patrons witnessing the impossible. Sheriff Vance, a man who wore his weight like a weapon and his authority like a shield, was frozen in place, his face twisting from a smug sneer to a grimace of sudden, blinding pain. Jack Riley hadn't struck him. There was no punch, no chaotic brawl that would have justified the deputies drawing their weapons. Instead, Jack employed a precise, calculated joint lock known in military circles as a wrist wave. With his thumb pressed into a nerve cluster on the back of Vance's hand and his fingers rotating the wrist outward, he effectively negated the larger man's leverage. Vance was forced onto his toes, his body contorting to the pressure or risking a fracture, rendering his brute strength useless against simple, masterfully applied anatomical physics. Jack's face remained a mask of stone. His breathing was even, his eyes locked on Vance's with an intensity that promised consequences far worse than a broken wrist if the sheriff dared to escalate. Behind the counter, Clara pressed herself against the prep station, clutching her burned leg, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and astonishment as she watched the stranger dismantle the town's biggest bully without breaking a sweat. "Let go of me," Vance sputtered, his voice strained and breathless, the red in his face deepening to a dangerous purple. He tried to yank his arm away, but the motion only increased the torque on his wrist, sending a fresh wave of pain up his shoulder. "You're assaulting an officer. I'll bury you under the jail." Jack didn't flinch. He leaned in closer, invading the sheriff's personal space until they were face to face. The smell of old coffee and fear radiated off Vance. Jack dropped his voice to a whisper, a sound so low it was meant for Vance alone, but it carried the weight of a sentence delivered by a higher court. "A real man," Jack rasped, his voice like sandpaper on concrete, "doesn't need a badge to feel strong, and he sure as hell never raises his hand to a woman. You touch her again, you even look at her with anything other than respect, and this wrist will be the least of your problems. Do you understand me?" The threat wasn't shouted. It was delivered with the calm certainty of a promise, terrifying in its lack of emotion. Vance looked back, searching for a bluff in Jack's eyes and finding only the abyss of a man who had witnessed violence in its rawest forms and was unimpressed by a small-town tyrant. The two deputies by the entrance finally shook off their shock. They were young men, barely out of their 20s, with crew cuts and uniforms that looked too new, likely hired more for their loyalty to Vance than for their police skills. "Hey, let him go," the taller deputy shouted, his hand moving nervously toward the taser on his belt. He took a step forward, aggressive but uncertain. That step was a mistake. From under the corner booth, a low, guttural vibration filled the air, a sound that tapped into a primal fear in the human brain. Kaiser emerged from the shadows. The German shepherd didn't bark or lunge wildly. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, placing himself squarely between Jack and the deputies. The hackles on his back were raised, forming a dark ridge along his spine, and his lips curled just enough to reveal white teeth capable of crushing bone. He stood perfectly still, his amber eyes fixed on the deputies. A silent sentinel awaiting a single command. The discipline was obvious. This wasn't a wild animal protecting its master, it was a soldier covering his partner's flank. The deputies froze, their hands hovering over their belts, intimidated not just by the dog, but by the sheer professionalism of the threat they faced. They were bullies used to pushing around farmers and teenagers, not confronting a combat-trained team. Clara, despite the searing pain in her ankle, looked out at the dining room. The fear that usually kept the townspeople silent was cracking. Old man Hemlock, who had been staring into his coffee cup just minutes before, was now sitting ramrod straight, his eyes hard. Near the window, Dale, a young farmhand with a beanie pulled low over his ears and hands calloused from hauling equipment, slowly stood up. He reached into the pocket of his plaid shirt and pulled out a smartphone. He didn't hide it. He held it up, the camera lens aimed squarely at Vance and his deputies. "I'm live streaming this, Sheriff," Dale announced, his voice shaking slightly but gaining strength as he spoke. "Straight to the community page. Everyone can see exactly what you did to Clara." Spurred by Dale's courage, Mrs. Gable, a retired schoolteacher sitting 2 tables over, pulled out her phone as well. Then another customer, and another. Within seconds, a wall of digital eyes surrounded the scene. The blinking red lights of recording were more effective than any shield Jack could have carried. They stripped Vance of his power to control the narrative. He couldn't spin this into an assault on an officer when the world had just watched him burn a waitress and get neutralized by a man defending her. Vance's eyes darted around the room, seeing the phones, seeing the defiance on the faces of the people he thought he owned. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He couldn't arrest Jack now, not without escalating the situation into a PR nightmare that would end his re-election campaign before it started. He needed to retreat, regroup, find a way to destroy this stranger in the dark where cameras couldn't see. He stopped struggling against Jack's hold. "All right," Vance spat, his voice thick with humiliation. "Have it your way." Jack held the lock for another second, ensuring the compliance was genuine before releasing Vance with a shove that sent the sheriff stumbling back into his deputies. Vance cradled his wrist, glaring at Jack with pure venom. He straightened his uniform, trying to reclaim some shred of dignity. "You think you're a hero?" Vance sneered, pointing a trembling finger at Jack. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life. You don't know how things work in Havenwood. I am the law here, and you," he turned on Clara, who flinched, "you better hope your new boyfriend sticks around, because when he's gone, there will be no one left to protect you." "Get lost, Brody," Hemlock growled from his booth, slamming a hand on the table. "Go on, git." A murmur of agreement from the room was the final straw. Vance gestured to his deputies, turned on his heel, and stormed out of the diner, the bell on the door chiming cheerfully behind him, a stark contrast to the grim mood he left in his wake. The moment the door closed, the tension in the room broke like a fever. Patrons lowered their phones, exchanging stunned looks. Jack didn't celebrate his victory. He didn't look at the customers or acknowledge their help. His entire demeanor shifted instantly from warrior to caregiver. The hardness in his eyes softened as he turned back to Clara. "Sit," he instructed gently, guiding her to a sturdy milk crate behind the counter. "Keep the weight off it." He gave a short, sharp whistle, and Kaiser immediately dropped his guard stance, trotting over to sit by the counter, his tail giving a single wag as if to say, "Mission accomplished." Jack knelt in front of Clara, ignoring the puddle of coffee soaking into the knee of his jeans. He reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out a small, vacuum-sealed first aid kit, the kind carried by men who anticipate injury as a part of daily life. "I'm going to get your shoe off," Jack said, his voice low and soothing, a stark contrast to the raw threat he delivered minutes before. "This might hurt." Clara nodded, biting her lip, tears of pain and humiliation welling up. "Thank you," she whispered, watching him work. "You didn't have to do that. He's going to come after you now." Jack expertly cut the laces of her cheap sneaker with a small folding knife to avoid pulling on the burned skin. He peeled the sock away with the care of a surgeon. The skin underneath was red and angry, already beginning to blister. "Let him come," Jack said simply, opening a packet of burn gel. He applied the cool salve to her skin, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle. He dressed the wound with sterile gauze with practiced efficiency. "For now, the only thing that matters is treating this. You need a doctor, but this will do for the moment." He looked up, meeting her eyes. For the first time, Clara saw past the soldier's shell to the man beneath, a man who was tired of fighting, but who couldn't stop protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. In that quiet moment on the dirty floor of a diner, amid the smell of burnt coffee and fear, a bond stronger than steel was forged. The retaliation began not with a bang, but with a sudden, suffocating silence. At precisely 6:00 p.m., the hum of the refrigerator in Clara's small, aging farmhouse died. The lights flickered once, a dying gasp of electricity, before plunging the living room into a gray twilight. Clara flipped the switch by the door uselessly, her shoulders slumping in defeat. She moved to the kitchen sink for a glass of water, but the faucet only sputtered a stream of brown sediment before running dry. Outside, the streetlights were glowing, and her neighbor's porch lights were a warm beacon, proof this wasn't a town-wide outage. This was personal. It was a message sent through copper wire and rusted pipe. Vance wasn't just the law. He was the gatekeeper of civilization in Havenwood, and he had just revoked Clara's membership. She went to the window, pulling back the curtain, and saw her car parked in the driveway. The windshield of her old sedan was shattered, a spiderweb of glass centered around a large rock resting on the dashboard. A ticket was tucked under the wiper. Parking violation. It was petty, cruel, and terrifyingly effective. Jack Riley stood in the hallway, his form blending into the deepening shadows. He had come back with her from the clinic, insisting on running a security check. He didn't seem surprised by the outage or the vandalism. To a Navy SEAL, these were standard psychological operations, tactics designed to break an enemy's will before the first shot was fired. "He wants you to feel helpless," Jack said, his voice calm and steady in the dark. "He wants you to think there's nowhere to turn." He lit a small camping lantern he'd retrieved from his truck, its soft LED glow illuminating his face. "Pack a bag for you and Caleb," he instructed, referring to her teenage brother, who was now at a friend's house for safety. "Just the essentials. We're not staying here tonight." Clara looked at him, fear warring with exhaustion in her eyes. "Where can we go?" "He controls this whole town, Jack. If we go to a motel, he'll have us thrown out. If we leave town, he'll pull us over for a broken tail light and plant something in the car." Jack shook his head. "We're not running, we're consolidating our position. But first, I need to know what we're dealing with. Lock the doors. Kaiser will stay with you." Jack left the house as the rural dusk began to thicken, melting into the night like a wraith. He drove his truck a few blocks away, parked it out of sight, and made his way on foot toward the old grain silos. The Havenwood Rail Depot was a maze of rusted metal and crumbling concrete structures, an industrial graveyard that Vance used as his personal kingdom. Jack moved with the silent, predatory grace of a man who'd spent a lifetime hunting in the dark. He bypassed the main gate, slipping through a gap in a chain-link fence he'd spotted earlier in the day. The air smelled of diesel, creosote, and damp earth. Two security guards, men who looked more like hired thugs than professionals, sat in a shack near the main silo, laughing over a card game, completely unaware that a lethal weapon was observing them from 20 yards away. Jack circled the perimeter, his eyes scanning markings on storage units stacked near the tracks. He stopped at a row of units that looked newer than the rest, their paint fresh and untouched by the elements. He used a small tactical pry bar to gently pop the seal on the nearest one. The door groaned open, a sound masked by a distant train whistle. Jack slipped inside, flicking on a flashlight with a red lens. The beam cut through the dark, revealing stacks of cardboard boxes. He drew his knife, slicing the tape on the top box. What he saw made his blood run cold. Inside were sealed packages of high-grade painkillers, surgical kits, and advanced portable diagnostic machines. He checked the manifest taped to the side of the unit. The destination was stamped clearly: Department of Veterans Affairs, Cleveland Distribution Center. This wasn't just bootleg electronics or counterfeit cigarettes. Vance was intercepting medical supplies intended for wounded veterans, for men and women who had bled for their country, and selling them on the black market for a profit. It was a federal crime. But more than that, it was a betrayal that struck at the very core of Jack's code. This wasn't just corruption anymore. This was treason against the people he called brothers and sisters. He slipped out of the unit, resealing it as best he could. He moved to a dark alcove between two silos and pulled out a satellite phone, a device that didn't rely on local cell towers that Vance could be monitoring. He dialed a number he hadn't used in 6 months. NCIS Field Office. "This line's secure," a clipped voice answered on the second ring. It was Agent Mike Miller, a former Marine turned federal investigator, a man whose by-the-book demeanor hid a fierce loyalty to the military. "Mike, it's Riley," Jack said, keeping his voice low. "I need you to listen, and I don't have a lot of time." He rattled off the unit numbers, the contents, and the location. "They're stealing from the VA, Mike. Morphine, surgical equipment, wheelchairs. It's a massive operation." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a heavy silence that spoke volumes. "You sure, Jack? That's a hell of an accusation." "I'm looking at the manifest right now," Jack replied, his voice hard. "Local law enforcement is the ringleader. I need a federal response. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Now." Miller sighed. The sound of keyboard clicks filled the background. "If it's VA property, that's federal jurisdiction. I can get a team moving, but it'll take us a few hours at least to get warrants and mobilize. You're on your own until then. Do not engage unless you have to. We need the chain of evidence intact." "Understood," Jack lied. He knew exactly what he had to do. He ended the call and melted back into the shadows, making his way back to Clara's house. The humidity had broken into a steady drizzle, masking his footsteps. When he arrived, he didn't go in right away. Instead, he scouted the perimeter. He found footprints in the mud near the back fence, fresh ones. Someone had been casing the house while he was gone. He slipped in the back door, finding Clara sitting on the living room floor with a flashlight, Kaiser's head resting on her lap. The dog's ears were perked, aimed toward the front yard. "We're about to have company," Jack whispered, motioning for her to stay put. He moved to the front window, peering through the blinds. An old sedan rolled slowly down the street, its headlights off. It stopped 2 houses down. 3 figures emerged, dressed in dark hoodies, carrying baseball bats and bottles stuffed with rags. Molotov cocktails. Vance wasn't just trying to scare her anymore. He was trying to burn her out. Jack moved quickly, not with panic, but with fluid efficiency. He'd set up a defensive perimeter earlier, a simple tripwire made of fishing lines strung between the porch rail and a sturdy oak tree, invisible in the dark. "Stay here. Cover your ears," he ordered Clara. He quietly unlocked the front door and waited in the darkened entryway. The 3 thugs crept up the walkway, confident in their anonymity. One of them, a twitchy kid named Billy, lit the rag on his bottle. The flame flared, illuminating his greasy face and panicked eyes. "Do it," Billy hissed to his accomplices. He stepped forward to throw the bomb, his foot catching the fishing line. He pitched forward with a yelp, the bottle flying from his hand and shattering on the concrete walkway, well short of the house. The gasoline ignited in a whoosh of orange flame, but it was harmlessly contained on the pavement. The other 2 thugs froze, confused. In that moment of hesitation, the front door flew open. Jack didn't look like a man. He looked like a demon emerging from the firelight. He launched himself at the nearest thug, a heavy-set man, driving his shoulder into the man's solar plexus, dropping him instantly. The third swung his bat, a wild, desperate arc. Jack ducked under the swing, sweeping the man's leg out from under him. The thug went down on the wet lawn with a sickening thud. Kaiser erupted in a deep, thunderous bark that sent the 2 conscious attackers scrambling back in terror. They abandoned their fallen accomplice, Billy, who was still tangled in the line, and sprinted for their car, tires squealing as they tore off into the night. Jack grabbed Billy by the collar of his hoodie, yanking him away from the burning gasoline and slamming him against the wall of the house. Kaiser stood inches from Billy's face, teeth bared, a low growl vibrating in his chest. "Who sent you?" Jack demanded, his voice cutting through the sound of the rain. Billy trembled, his eyes wide with terror, darting from the burning gas to the wolf-like dog. "It was Vance. He said to scare her. Just a scare." Jack tightened his grip, lifting the skinny man onto his toes. "A scare is a note. A firebomb is attempted murder. What else? What's he planning?" Billy sobbed, his resistance collapsing instantly. "He ain't done. He said, if he's there, you boys gotta make a distraction. He sent other guys to the hospital or a friend's house, wherever the kid is. He's going for the brother." Jack's blood ran cold. The vandalism, the power cut, this attack, it was all a diversion. Vance knew Jack would be protecting Clara. He was flanking them. He was going after the weakest link. "Caleb." Jack shoved Billy to the ground. "Get out of here. If I see you again, the dog gets a snack." Billy scrambled away into the darkness, not looking back. Jack turned to Clara, who was standing in the doorway, her face pale in the flickering light of the dying fire on her walkway. "Finish packing," Jack said, his voice grim. "We have to go. He's going after Caleb." The fight had just escalated, and the battlefield was no longer just a house. It was the whole town. The drive up the winding county road was a journey into the clouds. The rain that had terrorized the town below turned into a thick, enveloping fog as the altitude increased, shrouding the world in an eerie, white silence. Jack drove the truck with a steady hand, navigating the switchbacks of the gravel logging road as if he could see through the mist by instinct alone. Clara sat in the passenger seat, her hands clenched in her lap, watching the familiar lights of Havenwood disappear in the rearview mirror. It felt like she was leaving her life behind, untethering herself from the only reality she had ever known. Beside her, taking up the entire back seat, Kaiser slept with one eye open, his big head resting on his paws, sensing the tension radiating from the humans in the front. They reached the safe house just after midnight. It was a sturdy, A-frame cabin of weathered cedar, tucked into a grove of old-growth pines that whispered secrets on the wind. It belonged to a former captain of Jack's, a man who had sought peace and solitude years ago, and who had given Jack a key for emergencies. Inside, the air was stale and cold, smelling of pine needles and winters past. Jack moved efficiently, lighting a kerosene lamp that cast long, dancing shadows on the wood-paneled walls. He checked the perimeter, threw the heavy deadbolt on the door, and covered the windows with thick wool blankets found in a cedar chest. "We're secure," he said, his voice low. "Try and get some sleep, Clara. You need it." Clara nodded, though sleep felt impossible. She curled up on the dusty sofa, wrapped in a quilt, and watched Jack. He didn't lie down. He took a seat in a straight-backed wooden chair near the door, arms crossed, chin dipped to his chest. He was resting, but he wasn't sleeping. He was on watch. Hours passed in the quiet of the cabin. The storm outside beat against the roof, a rhythmic drumming that finally lulled Clara into a fitful sleep. She woke sometime before dawn to a sound that wasn't the wind. It was a low, agonized moan. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, and looked toward the door. Jack was still in the chair, but his stillness was broken. His head was moving slightly from side to side, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill in the room. His breaths were shallow and quick, his hands gripping the arms of the chair so tightly his knuckles were white. He was muttering words she couldn't make out, the names of men long gone. It was a nightmare, raw and terrifying, stripping away the soldier's stoic armor to reveal the wounded man beneath. Before Clara could move, Kaiser was there. The old dog, who usually moved with the stiff gait of arthritis, was instantly alert. He didn't bark. He approached Jack slowly, making a low, chuffing sound deep in his throat. He put his front paws on Jack's knees and nudged his wet nose into Jack's hand. When that didn't work, Kaiser licked Jack's face, a gentle, reassuring, persistent action. Jack gasped, his eyes flying open, blank and vacant for a terrifying second before they focused on the dog. The tension drained out of his body like water from a broken dam. He sagged back in the chair, one hand burying itself in the thick fur of Kaiser's ruff. "I'm okay, buddy," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm okay." He looked up and saw Clara watching him. Shame flickered across his face, quickly replaced by his usual mask. But it was too late. She had seen. "He saves me," Jack said simply, stroking the dog's ears. "Pulls me back every night." Clara walked over, pulling the quilt tighter around her shoulders. She didn't offer pity. She offered understanding. "You saved us tonight," she said softly. "Maybe we all need a little saving sometimes." For the first time, the barrier between them, the protector and the protected, dissolved. They were just two people carrying burdens, finding a moment of respite in the storm, but the peace was fragile, and down in the valley, it was already broken. Caleb Evans, Clara's 16-year-old brother, was a lanky kid with a shock of unruly hair and his sister's stubborn chin. He was currently pacing the floor of his friend Mark's basement, where Clara had told him to stay put. But Caleb had a problem. He knew things Clara tried to hide. He knew their mom's prescription was ready at the county hospital pharmacy, and he knew that without it, her pain would become unbearable. The next morning, he checked his phone. No signal from Clara. The storm must have knocked out the lines. Young, impulsive, and driven by a desperate love for his mother, Caleb made a choice that would change everything. "I'll be back in an hour," he told Mark, pulling his hoodie up. "Just going to check on Mom." He slipped out the back door into the rain, taking a shortcut through the alleys toward the hospital. He thought he was invisible. He was wrong. Vance's deputies weren't brilliant, but they were persistent, and they knew the rhythms of the town. They had a car parked near the hospital entrance, watching the sliding doors. When a drenched teenager in a hoodie tried to slip into the pharmacy entrance, Deputy Miller recognized him instantly. "Got him," Miller grunted into his radio. They moved in before Caleb knew they were there. Two uniformed men grabbed him, hauling him toward an unmarked patrol car while Caleb kicked and yelled, his cries swallowed by a clap of thunder. They didn't take him to the station. They took him to the silos. Back at the cabin, the first light of dawn was trying to pierce the gray fog when Clara's phone buzzed. It was a jarring, alien sound in the quiet room. She scrambled for it, her heart leaping into her throat when she saw the caller ID. Not Caleb. An unknown number. She swiped to answer, her hand shaking. "Hello?" A choppy video feed appeared. The connection was staticky, but the image was clear enough to make her heart stop. It was Caleb. He was zip-tied to a metal chair in a dim, industrial space. His lip was split and bleeding, and his eyes were wide with terror. "Caleb!" Clara screamed. The camera panned away from her brother to reveal the flushed, sweating face of Sheriff Vance. He was smiling, a cruel, triumphant smile that made Clara's skin crawl. "Morning, sunshine," Vance sneered. "Told you I'd make you listen. You didn't want to sell the land. You didn't want to leave. So now we're gonna do this the hard way." "Don't hurt him," Clara pleaded, leaning closer to the screen. "Please, Vance, he's just a kid. This is between you and me." Vance laughed. "It is between you and me. Which is why you're gonna come down here alone to settle it. No soldier boy, no dog, just you. Silo number 9 at the rail depot. You got 1 hour. If I see anyone else or if you call the feds, well, accidents happen in warehouses." The screen went dead. The silence that followed was heavier than the mountain. Clara stood frozen, the phone slipping from her numb fingers and clattering to the wooden floor. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her chest. "I have to go," she whispered, her voice trembling. She fumbled for her keys, her movements frantic and uncoordinated. "I have to go. He is Caleb." He said, "Come alone." She lunged for the door, blind to everything but the image of her brother tied to that chair. A hand clamped down on her arm. It wasn't rough, but it was immovable. Jack stood between her and the door. He had heard everything. "Clara, stop," he said, his voice calm and commanding. "Let me go," she cried, struggling against his grip, tears streaming down her face. "He'll kill him. You heard him. I have to go alone." Jack didn't release her. He pulled her slightly closer, forcing her to look at him. "If you go alone, you're not coming back. And neither is Caleb. That's how men like Vance work. He doesn't want a negotiation. He wants a victim." Clara sobbed, her fight draining out of her. "Then what do I do? I can't let him die." Jack let go of her arm and placed his hands on her shoulders. He looked deep into her eyes, transmitting all the certainty he had. "We don't negotiate with terrorists," he said, the soldier in him taking complete command. "And we never, ever leave a man behind. Today, you're my man. Caleb is our mission." He turned away, moving toward the large duffel bag he had brought into the cabin. The zipper hissed open. Inside were the tools of his trade, not standard military-issue weapons, since he was on leave, but tactical gear he had acquired for survival: a pair of night vision goggles, a spool of high-tensile paracord, smoke grenades, a serrated-edge combat knife, and a tactical plate carrier. He began to gear up, his movements precise and ritualistic. He slipped the carrier over his hoodie, cinching the straps tight. He checked the edge of his blade. He looked at Kaiser, who was sitting by the door, ears perked, sensing the shift in energy. "Kaiser," Jack said softly. "Work mode." The dog's posture changed instantly. The goofy, lovable pet vanished, replaced by a focused, lethal working dog. Jack turned back to Clara. He looked terrifying, a warrior preparing for battle. But when he spoke, his voice was gentle. "We are going to get him back," Jack promised. "I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Clara wiped at her tears, looking at the man and the dog who were willing to walk into the fire for her. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the panic receding just enough for resolve to take its place. "Yes," she said. "I trust you." Jack nodded, pulling open the door to the misty morning. "Then let's go hunting." The fog clung to the Havenwood rail depot so thick you could taste it, a gritty mix of diesel and damp earth that blurred the shapes of the towering silos and rusted train cars. It was the kind of weather that made civilians roll up their windows and drive a little faster. But for Jack Riley, it was cover. He moved through the shadows of the perimeter fence, not like a man, but like a wraith, his silhouette blending perfectly with the industrial gloom. He had left Clara and Kaiser in the truck a quarter-mile back, hidden behind an abandoned cannery. Kaiser had whined low in his throat, sensing the danger, but Jack had given the command to stay. A solo infiltration required absolute silence, and while Kaiser was disciplined, the metal grates and echoing corridors of a silo complex were no place for pause until the fight started. This part of the mission belonged to the SEAL alone. Silo number 9 loomed ahead, a monster of corrugated metal that seemed to swallow the weak light from the security lamps. 2 guards patrolled the main entrance. One was a man Jack recognized from town, Deputy Haynes. Haynes was a soft-jawed man in his late 20s with a perpetually untucked uniform, the kind of bully who used his badge for free meals and to intimidate teenagers. He was currently leaning against a wall, scrolling on his phone, oblivious to the world. The other was a hired thug, bigger, dressed in a dark jacket and smoking a cigarette that glowed like a firefly in the gloom. Jack watched them for a full minute, timing their movements, analyzing their sightlines. He wasn't here to kill. Killing was for war, and as dangerous as this was, it was still a rescue operation on American soil. His code and the law demanded restraint. These men were obstacles, not targets. Jack picked up a rusted bolt from the ground and tossed it against a stack of empty oil drums 20 yards to the left. The clang of metal on metal was sharp and surprising in the quiet night. "What was that?" the smoker asked, his hand dropping to the pistol holstered at his belt. "Probably a rat," Haynes grumbled, not looking up from his phone. "Go check it out." The smoker grunted and walked toward the sound. It was the mistake Jack needed. He moved in behind the smoker, his boots making no sound on the wet pavement. Before the man could turn, Jack applied a sleeper hold, his arm compressing the carotid arteries with surgical precision. The man went limp in seconds, unconscious before he hit the ground. Jack lowered him gently, dragged him into the shadows, and secured his hands and feet with zip ties. Haynes was next. The deputy was just starting to look up, wondering where his partner had gone, when Jack materialized beside him. Haynes's mouth opened, his hand reaching for his radio, but Jack was faster. He snatched the radio from the deputy's belt and delivered a quick, controlled punch to the solar plexus, knocking the wind out of him, followed by a precise chop to the side of the neck. Haynes crumpled. Jack caught him, lowering him beside the door. "Take a nap," Jack whispered. He secured the deputy, disabling their comms, and slipped through a side door of the silo's ground floor annex. Inside, the space was vast, a cathedral of crime, lit by hanging sodium lamps that cast a sick yellow glow on everything. The air was thick with the smell of dust and unwashed bodies. The floor was a maze of stacked crates and storage bins. Jack donned thermal goggles, scanning the area. He saw heat signatures near the center of the room. 2 more guards, playing cards at a makeshift table. But his focus was on a standalone storage unit near the back office, separate from the rest. That had to be the holding cell. Jack moved through the aisles, using the stacked crates for cover. He bypassed the card players, moving up to a high catwalk to get a better vantage point. From above, he saw the storage unit's door was slightly ajar. A single guard, older and more alert than the others, stood watch with a shotgun. This was the final obstacle. Jack unspooled a length of paracord from his belt. He waited until the guard walked beneath the catwalk, then dropped. He didn't land on the man. He landed behind him, the impact absorbed by a roll. The guard spun around, bringing the shotgun up, but Jack was already inside his guard. He disarmed the man with a wrist twist and swept his legs out from under him. The guard hit the concrete hard and Jack silenced him with a precise punch to the jaw. With the path clear, Jack entered the storage unit. The smell of fear and old sweat hit him instantly. In the corner, zip-tied to a metal chair, was Caleb. The boy looked small and broken. His face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, and he was shaking uncontrollably. "Caleb," Jack said softly, removing his goggles so the boy could see his face. Caleb flinched, terrified, until recognition dawned in his good eye. "Jack," he rasped, his voice dry and cracked. "Clara? Is she okay?" Even in his state, the boy was worried about his sister. Jack felt a surge of respect for him. "She's safe. She sent me. We're going home." Jack cut the zip ties with his serrated knife. Caleb tried to stand but staggered, his legs numb from lack of circulation. Jack caught him, taking the boy's weight. "I've got you. Easy now." Jack looked around the unit. It wasn't just a cell. It was a storeroom. Stacked from floor to ceiling were boxes bearing the Department of Veterans Affairs insignia. Jack pulled the top off one. Inside were vials of high-grade morphine and sealed surgical kits. This was it, the smoking gun. Vance was stealing painkillers from wounded veterans to peddle on the streets. The anger in Jack's chest flared, a righteous fury that demanded justice, but he suppressed it. The mission came first. He pulled out his secure satellite phone. He took 3 clear pictures of the contraband and the location markings on all the container walls. Then he accessed the secure app he'd used to contact Agent Miller earlier. He typed in the GPS coordinates, attaching the photos. Target secured. Federal property confirmed. Hostage rescued. Requesting immediate extraction. He hit send. The message vanished into the ether, a digital beacon calling down the wrath of the federal government. "All right, Caleb," Jack said, pocketing the phone. "We're moving. Stay behind me. If I stop, you stop. If I say run, you run. Got it?" Caleb nodded, wincing as he put weight on his bruised ankle. "Yes, sir." They moved toward the exit, Jack guiding the limping teenager through the shadows. They were 20 yards from the side door when a loud, mechanical click echoed through the annex. A red laser grid flickered to life across the exit, cutting off their path. Jack froze, pushing Caleb behind a stack of crates. He'd missed a motion sensor. It was a civilian model, probably installed recently, clumsy but effective. High above, a klaxon began to wail, an ear-splitting siren that shattered the silence. Floodlights snapped on, bathing the annex in brilliant white light. Well, Vance's voice crackled over a PA system, distorted by static, but dripping with malice. "Didn't think you'd actually get inside, soldier boy. You're better than I thought." The large bay doors at the front and back of the annex began to groan. Heavy steel shutters descended rapidly to seal the building. "Run!" Jack yelled, grabbing Caleb's arm. They sprinted for the side door, but it was now electronically locked. Jack kicked it, but the reinforced steel frame didn't budge. The shutter slammed down with a final, ominous thud, plunging the annex into a sealed trap. They were locked in. Jack pulled Caleb into the cover of a forklift just as the interior office door burst open. Vance stepped out onto the balcony above, flanked by 3 more deputies with weapons drawn. "You're trespassing on private property, Riley," Vance shouted, his face flushed with triumph. "And you're armed. That gives me the right to defend myself. See, in Havenwood, the story is whatever I say it is. And tomorrow's paper will say a crazed PTSD vet broke in, killed a hostage, and had to be put down." Jack checked his surroundings. No exits. 4 hostiles on high ground. 1 wounded civilian to protect. The odds were bad, but Jack Riley had built his career on bad odds. He looked at Caleb, who was trembling. "Get down," Jack said, his voice calm, devoid of fear. "Keep your head low. The cavalry is coming. We just have to stay alive until they get here." He checked his non-lethal smoke grenades. He had 2 left. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. The cat-and-mouse game was over. Now it was a siege. The air inside the annex shifted from the smell of old dust to the chemical tang of gasoline. Sheriff Vance stood on the steel balcony overlooking the floor, his face bathed in the harsh glare of the floodlights, slick with sweat and a crazed desperation. The plan had gone wrong. The soldier wasn't supposed to be this good, and the kid wasn't supposed to be found. Vance knew his fragile ecosystem of power was collapsing. If those pictures Jack had taken got out, if the feds really were coming, there would be no jail cell comfortable enough to hold him. He made a choice born of panic and absolute self-preservation. He gestured to his 2 remaining loyal deputies, men who were too deep in his pocket to refuse. "Burn it," Vance ordered, his voice cracking over the PA system. "Burn it all. Old structure. Faulty wiring, a tragedy. Just make sure nothing survives." The deputies hesitated for a millisecond, looking at the terrified teenager cowering behind the forklift below, but their fear of Vance and the promise of a cut of the insurance money won. They grabbed red gas cans stored near a generator and began sloshing the fuel over wooden crates, the liquid arcing through the air like black rain. Jack Riley watched from behind the cover of a heavy industrial forklift, his heart beating a steady, measured rhythm against his ribs. He smelled the fuel before he saw it. "Caleb, listen to me," Jack said, his voice calm and commanding, cutting through the rising panic in the boy's eyes. "They're going to light this place up. We need to move right now." He grabbed a heavy canvas tarp from a nearby pallet, pulling it over both of them. "Stay low. Breathe through your shirt." Above them, a flare was struck. It hissed, a bright red star falling from the balcony and landing in a pool of gasoline. The world erupted in orange and black. The fire didn't grow. It roared, consuming the dry wood and fuel with an almost living hunger. The heat was immediate, a physical wall that pressed in on them. The exit was blocked by a curtain of flame. Smoke began to bank down from the ceiling, a thick, choking blanket that was turning the air to poison. They were trapped in a furnace, and the devil was watching from the balcony. Outside the perimeter fence, Clara Evans stood in the cold drizzle, listening to the muffled sounds of shouting and the sudden, terrifying roar of fire from within the silo complex. She saw the orange glow flicker against the high windows, and she knew. She knew they were burning her brother alive. Despair, cold and paralyzing, threatened to crush her. But then she looked at the phone in her hand. It was the only weapon she had left. She didn't call 911. Vance controlled the dispatch. She didn't call the news. They were too far away. She opened the community social media app, the digital town square where Havenwood shared gossip, lost cat photos, and farming reports. She hit go live. The screen flickered, showing her face, pale, rain-streaked, and etched with a raw, terrifying grief. "Please," Clara began, her voice trembling but gaining strength with every word. "Please, if anyone can hear me, I need help. I'm at the rail depot, silo number 9. Sheriff Vance has my brother, Caleb, inside. He has a soldier named Jack Riley in there and he just set the building on fire." She turned the camera toward the silo where smoke began to pour from the vents, black against the night sky. "You all know me. I served you coffee this morning. You know Caleb. He mows your lawns. He bags your groceries. He's 16. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the rain. "Vance is killing them to cover up his crimes. He's stealing medicine from veterans. He's hurting us because he thinks we're weak. He thinks we won't do anything because we're just poor folks from a dying town." She looked back into the camera, her eyes blazing with a maternal fire. "But we are not weak. We're neighbors. We're family. And I am begging you, please don't let them die. Please come down here right now." The live stream hit 300 viewers, then 500, then 1,000. In living rooms all over Havenwood, TVs were muted. Dinner conversations stopped. Phones were passed from hand to hand. Old man Hemlock, sitting in his armchair, watched the video, looked at his wife, and stood up, grabbing the keys to his old Ford truck. Dale, the young farmhand, ran out of the local bar, shouting for everyone to follow. Mrs. Gable, the retired teacher, called her son, a foreman at a construction site, and told him to bring the boys. It wasn't a coordinated military operation. It was something more powerful. It was a community waking up. It was the realization that an attack on one of their own was an attack on all of them. Engines rumbled to life in driveways. Garage doors opened. The sleepy streets of Havenwood were suddenly full of the sound of tires on wet pavement, all heading in one direction. Back inside the inferno, the heat was becoming unbearable. Jack had Caleb pressed to the concrete floor, the damp tarp shielding them. The fire had cut off the main level and the smoke was dropping lower, leaving them only a sliver of breathable air. "Jack," Caleb coughed, his voice weak. I can't breathe." "Stay with me, kid," Jack rasped, his own lungs burning. "We're not done yet." He scanned the room through the smoke. The fire was compromising the structural integrity of the loading bay doors. If he could ram them with something heavy enough, they might buckle. He looked at the forklift. It was old, propane-powered. It might work, or the tank might explode in the heat. It was a gamble, but staying put was a death sentence. He was about to move when a sound cut through the roar of the fire. It wasn't a siren, it was a horn. A deep, loud truck horn blasted, followed by another, and another, until a chorus of horns surrounded the building. Outside, the chain-link fence separating the silo from the road groaned and then shattered under the weight of a massive snowplow truck driven by Old Man Hemlock. He smashed through the gate, dragging the twisted metal with him, clearing a path for the cavalry. Behind him, a fleet of vehicles descended on the depot. There were old pickup trucks, minivans, construction vehicles, and flatbeds. Dozens of them. They didn't stop at the gate. They drove right up to the entrance of the annex, forming a semicircle around the burning building and the deputies stationed outside. Then, as one, they turned on their lights. Headlights, fog lamps, and roof-mounted spotlights pierced the fog and smoke, creating a blinding wall of light. It was a physical force, pushing back the darkness Vance relied on. The deputies, weapons drawn, shielded their eyes, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of light thrown at them. They couldn't see their targets. They could only see the glaring accusation of their neighbors. Horns blared, an auditory weapon of outrage. People started pouring out of their vehicles, not with weapons, but with presence. There were burly farmers holding tire irons, old women with their arms crossed, veterans in their old service caps. They formed a human chain, a living barrier between the corrupt lawman and the fire. Vance ran to a side door, coughing, escaping the smoke, expecting to see an empty lot. Instead, he was met with the blinding glare of 50 vehicles. He froze, his hand on his holstered pistol. "Get back!" he screamed, his voice lost in the noise. "This is a police action." "It's a murder scene," Dale yelled from the front of the crowd, holding a road flare of his own. "And we're the witnesses." The deputies looked at the crowd. They saw the faces of the people they bought groceries from, the people they went to church with. They saw Mrs. Gable, who had taught 2 of them in the 3rd grade, staring at them with a look of profound disappointment that felt like a physical blow. Slowly, one deputy lowered his gun, then another. They couldn't shoot into a crowd of grandmothers and farmers. The psychological weight of the community had broken their compliance. Vance stood alone, illuminated, exposed, and powerless against the collective will of the people he had tormented for years. Inside, Jack heard the commotion. He didn't know exactly what was happening, but he knew the deputies were distracted. "Now," Jack yelled. He grabbed Caleb, slung him over his shoulder in a fireman's carry, and sprinted not for the blocked exits, but for the office window Vance had just fled from. He smashed the glass with the butt of a fire extinguisher he'd grabbed. He cleared the shards and vaulted through, landing on the exterior metal balcony, gasping at the cool, damp air. He scrambled down the side ladder, sliding the last 10 feet, hitting the ground with a heavy thud. He looked up and saw the wall of light. He saw the trucks. He saw Clara running toward him, past the line of neighbors who parted for her like the Red Sea. She didn't care about the fire or the guns. She crashed into them, hugging Caleb and Jack, sobbing. Jack looked at the crowd, at the old men in flannel, the women in raincoats, the wall of headlights pushing back the night. He realized he hadn't just called the FBI. Clara had called something more powerful. She had called a family. The safety of the paved yard where Jack and Caleb had landed was an illusion that lasted only seconds. The fire inside the silo, fed by the accelerants Vance's deputies had spread, was not behaving like a natural beast. It was greedy and unnatural. A huge section of the burning roof groaned like a dying leviathan and collapsed outward, crashing into the yard with the force of a bomb. Flaming debris flew everywhere, cutting off the path to the main gate where the townspeople were gathered. A wall of heat and thick, greasy black smoke slammed into Jack and Caleb, driving them back against the crumbling brick of the main building. They were caught in a pocket of air that was shrinking by the second, pinned between the inferno and a high concrete sea wall. The heat was scorching, singeing the hair on their arms and instantly drying their eyes. Caleb coughed violently, his legs buckling under the strain of terror and smoke inhalation. "I can't," the boy gasped, sliding down the wall. "Jack, I can't breathe." Jack grabbed the collar of Caleb's jacket, hauling him upright, though his own lungs felt full of broken glass. "Stay with me, Caleb. Keep your eyes open." Jack scanned the yard. The fire had them completely boxed in. There was no way over the wall and no way back through the building. For the first time in his career, Jack Riley calculated the odds and found they were 0. He shielded Caleb with his body, preparing for the end, when a shape hurtled through the curtain of smoke to their left. It wasn't a rescuer. It was a wolf-like form moving low to the ground. Kaiser. The old German shepherd had broken from Clara's grasp at the fence line, driven by an instinct deeper than survival, the need to be with his pack. The dog didn't run to Jack for comfort. He ran with a purpose. He let out a single, sharp bark, a sound that cut through the roar of the fire, and began pawing frantically at a rusted iron grate set into the concrete floor near a drain. Jack understood instantly. It was an old industrial culvert that probably led out to the river. He lunged for it, grabbing the rusted bars of the grate. It was heavy, fused by years of neglect and damp air. "Help me!" Jack yelled at Caleb. The boy, fueled by adrenaline, grabbed the other side. Together, they heaved. The metal shrieked in protest, then gave way, flipping open to reveal a dark, wet hole that smelled of decay and river water. It was the most beautiful thing Jack had ever smelled. "Go," Jack ordered, practically throwing Caleb into the darkness below. "Kaiser, go." The dog hesitated, looking at Jack, but Jack gave him a gentle shove into the hole. Jack looked up one last time. The remaining roof structure above them was tilting, the steel beams glowing red and buckling. He dove into the drain just as the world above them collapsed. Tons of concrete and burning timber crashed down into the yard, burying the spot where they had been standing seconds before. The tunnel was a claustrophobic nightmare, a narrow concrete tube half filled with freezing muck. They crawled on hands and knees, the sound of the fire muffled by the earth above, replaced by their own ragged gasps and the splash of sludge. Kaiser led the way, his nose held high to keep it out of the water, guiding them toward the faint smell of fresh air. They crawled for what felt like miles, but was probably only 50 yards. The tunnel widened, and Jack saw moonlight reflecting on water ahead. They scrambled toward it, tumbling out of a drainage opening and onto the rocky bank of the river, gasping for air that tasted of salt and rain. They were covered in black soot and mud, shaking violently, but they were alive. They scrambled up the rocky embankment toward the service road that ran parallel to the silos. They were alive, but they weren't safe. As they crested the hill, silhouetted against the burning annex, a figure stepped out from behind his patrol car. It was Sheriff Vance. He looked unhinged, his uniform covered in soot, his eyes wide and crazed. He had fled the crowd at the front gate, circling around to the service road to make his escape, only to see the ghosts he thought he'd just incinerated rising from the earth. He didn't hesitate. He drew his service pistol, leveling it at Jack's chest. "You won't die," Vance screamed, his voice cracking. "Why won't you just die?" Jack pushed Caleb behind him. He was unarmed, his knife was lost in the tunnel, and he was exhausted. "It's over, Vance," Jack said, his voice steady despite the gun aimed at his heart. "The whole town knows, the feds are on their way. Put the gun down." Vance laughed, a high, piercing sound. "I'm the law. I say when it's over. I'll say you attacked me. I'll say you set the fire. Who are they gonna believe? A dead drifter or the sheriff?" Vance's finger tightened on the trigger. Jack tensed, preparing to lunge, knowing he wouldn't make it before the bullet hit him. Suddenly, the night turned to day. A dozen vehicles from the crowd at the front gate had anticipated Vance's flight path or heard the commotion. They had driven around the perimeter fence and lined up on the hillside overlooking the service road. As one, they hit their high beams. It wasn't just the yellow light of old trucks. It was the penetrating white LED bars of modern off-roaders, the searchlights from fishing boats mounted on trailers, and the fog lights of minivans. The wall of light slammed into Vance with physical force. He cried out, blinded, throwing a hand up to shield his eyes. He couldn't see his target. He couldn't see anything but a searing white abyss. The horn started again, a deafening, relentless judgment from the community he had terrorized. Then a new sound cut through the noise, a sound that carried the weight of absolute authority. It was the shriek of a different, sharper siren, followed by the deep rumble of heavy engines. 2 black SUVs with federal plates and 3 state police cruisers barreled down the service road, skidding into position to block Vance's escape. They didn't move with the chaotic energy of the town. They moved with the precision of a falling hammer. Doors flew open. Men and women in tactical gear poured out, their movements synchronized. "Federal agents, drop the weapon. Drop it now." The voice belonged to Agent Mike Miller, Jack's contact. He stepped out of the lead SUV, wearing a windbreaker with NCIS emblazoned in bold yellow. Beside him was a Captain Reynolds of the state police, a tall, severe woman with a face that tolerated no nonsense. Vance blinked, trying to clear the spots from his vision, waving his gun wildly. "They attacked me. I'm the sheriff. You answer to me." "Sheriff Vance," Agent Miller's voice, amplified by a bullhorn, echoed off the burning silo, "you are under arrest for theft of federal property, trafficking of a controlled substance, arson, and conspiracy to commit murder. Drop the weapon or we will open fire." Vance looked at the federal agents, then at the wall of town vehicles, then at Jack, standing covered in mud but unbroken. The realization finally hit him. The bubble had burst. The kingdom was gone. His hand trembled and the gun clattered to the asphalt. Before the sound of the metal hitting the ground faded, 4 officers were on him. They weren't rough with him. They didn't need to be. They spun him around, forced him to his knees, and cinched the cuffs. It was clinical, cold, and finally, humiliating. Jack sagged, the adrenaline leaving his body in a rush. He felt a wet nose on his hand. Kaiser was there, leaning against his leg. Clara ran down the embankment, sliding on the wet grass, ignoring the police line. Caleb. Jack. She crashed into them, checking Caleb's burns, touching Jack's face to make sure he was real. I thought I saw the roof collapse. I thought you were dead. Caleb buried his face in his sister's shoulder, sobbing. The dog found a way out, Caleb choked out. Jack carried me. They saved me. Agent Miller walked over to the group. He looked at Jack, filthy, exhausted, but standing tall. He looked at the burning silo where the evidence was being destroyed. But then he looked at the phone in his own hand, where Jack's pictures and GPS coordinates had been secured hours ago. Lieutenant Riley, Miller said, with a nod of respect. You cut it a little close. Traffic was bad, Jack quipped, his voice raw. You get everything you need? Miller gestured to Vance, who was being shoved into the back of a federal transport van, screaming obscenities at the townspeople who watched in silent satisfaction. We've got the digital trail. We've got testimony from his accomplices, who are currently singing like canaries to the state police. And we've got a town full of witnesses. It's over, Jack. He'll never see the outside of a cell again. The townspeople began to walk down from the hillside. They weren't cheering. This wasn't a sporting event. It was a funeral for a dark era. Old Man Hemlock walked up, clapping a heavy hand on Jack's shoulder. Dale, the farmhand, gave a nod of respect. They surrounded Clara and her brother, forming a protective circle that no sheriff could ever break again. As medics arrived to check on Caleb, Jack stepped back, letting the family have their moment. He looked down at Kaiser. Good boy, he whispered. You did good. The old dog wagged his tail, leaving a streak of mud on Jack's leg. The fire still blazed behind them, but it felt different now. It wasn't a weapon of destruction anymore. It was a cleansing fire, burning away the rot to make room for something new. The sun that rose over Havenwood a month later felt different. It wasn't the pale silver disk that usually struggled to burn through the Ohio Valley haze. It was a brilliant, confident gold that had the mist burned off the river by mid-morning. The town, too, seemed to have undergone a similar transformation. The oppressive weight of Sheriff Vance's reign had been lifted, replaced by a hustle of activity that felt like a deep breath after being underwater for too long. The rail depot was active again. Legitimate freight trains moved through without fear of inspection fees. The silo complex was being cleaned up. The charred skeleton of Silo 9 stood as a grim monument to the past, surrounded by scaffolding for the future community center the town council had voted to build on the site. But the brightest jewel in the revitalized town stood on Main Street. The diner, formerly the Crossroads, had been scrubbed clean, repainted a cheerful shade of sky blue, and renamed. Above the door, a hand-carved wooden sign swung gently in the breeze, the Sentinel. Inside, Clara Evans moved through the tables with a lightness in her step that had been missing for years. The smell of old grease was gone, replaced by the aroma of freshly baked bread and brewing coffee. She wore a clean apron, her hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and her face was fuller, brighter. Her brother, Caleb, worked the counter. His cast had come off 3 days prior, leaving him with a slight limp doctors said would fade, but his smile was permanent. He joked with Old Man Hemlock, who was now trying to convince Mrs. Gable that the new menu prices were a conspiracy, though he paid happily. The diner was packed not just with customers, but with friends. The night of the headlights, as the townspeople called it, had forged bonds that no hardship could break. Yet, despite the laughter and the clatter of silverware, there was a bittersweet undercurrent to the morning. Everyone knew what day it was. In the corner booth, now reserved by an unspoken town decree, sat Jack Riley. He wasn't in his hoodie and jeans today. He was in uniform, crisp and pressed desert camo, a duffel bag on the floor beside him. He looked every inch the Navy SEAL, formidable and disciplined, but his eyes were gentle as he watched Clara work. His leave was over. The investigation into the stolen VA supplies had earned him a commendation and an expedited return to active duty. The world was still a dangerous place, and men like Jack Riley were still needed to stand on the wall. But this departure felt different. It felt like leaving home. Kaiser sat under the table, his head resting on Jack's polished boot. The old dog looked years younger. His coat was glossy, his ribs no longer showed, and the haunted look in his eyes had been replaced with a calm, watchful contentment. Clara refilled Jack's coffee, her hand lingering near his for a moment. "You didn't have to pay for the repairs, Jack," she said quietly, referring to the substantial check he had silently left on the counter the day the contractors finished the farmhouse roof. "The insurance didn't cover all of it." "I know," Jack said. He took a sip of coffee, looking out the window at the bustling street. "Consider it payment for all the bacon Kaiser has stolen." Clara smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "What time's the bus?" she asked, the question she'd been dreading all morning. 1,400 hours, Jack replied. "Takes me to the base airfield. Wheels up at 1800. 3 hours." That was all they had left. The reality of military life hung between them. The sudden departures, the long silences, the uncertainty of return. As the lunch rush died down, Jack stood. He picked up his duffel, but he didn't pick up Kaiser's leash. He gave a soft whistle, and the dog trotted out from under the table. Jack knelt, bringing himself eye level with the animal who had been his shadow, his therapist, and his battle buddy through the darkest nights of his life. He scratched behind Kaiser's ears, right in the spot that made the dog's leg twitch. "Hey, buddy," Jack whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "We had a good run, didn't we?" Kaiser licked his face, sensing the goodbye. Jack unclipped the tactical leash from Kaiser's collar and stood, offering the leather loop to Clara. Clara looked at the leash, then at Jack, confusion clouding her face. "Jack, you can't. He's your dog. He needs you." Jack shook his head slowly. "He's a working dog, Clara. He spent 6 years sniffing out bombs and chasing bad guys. He's tired. His hips ache when it rains, and he flinches at loud noises." He looked down at Kaiser, who had moved to sit beside Clara, leaning his weight against her leg. "I'm going back to a place where things explode. I can't take him with me, and I won't put him in a kennel for 6 months. He deserves a soft bed. He deserves bacon scraps. He deserves peace." Jack looked at Clara, his blue eyes intense and sincere. "And you? You need someone watching the door. Vance is gone, but it's a big world. I can't be here to protect you, but he can. He chose you, Clara. From that first day with the bacon. He never looked at me like that." Clara took the leash, her fingers trembling as they closed over the worn leather. She looked down at Kaiser. The dog looked up at her, his tail giving a slow, rhythmic thump against the floor. He knew, in the way animals always know the heart of things, he understood his new mission. "I'll take care of him," Clara promised, her voice catching. "He'll eat like a king. He'll sleep on the bed. I promise." Jack smiled, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his face. "I know. That's why I'm leaving him." They walked to the bus stop together, leaving Caleb to mind the diner. The stop was just a bench near the marina overlooking the river, where the sun was beginning its descent, painting the water in shades of violet and fire. The air was fresh and smelled of the water, a smell of freedom now, not stagnation. The military transport bus was already there, its engine idling with a deep rumble. A few other service members were boarding, saying tearful goodbyes to their families. Jack set his bag near the door, but didn't get on. He turned to Clara. They stood in the fading light, two people from different worlds who had collided in a storm and saved each other. There were no grand speeches, no cinematic declarations of undying love. Just the quiet, heavy truth of gratitude and connection. Jack reached into his shirt and pulled out the chain he wore around his neck. 2 metal tags dangled from it, his dog tags, the identification every soldier carries to ensure they are not forgotten by history. He unclasped the chain and slid one of the tags off. He reached out and took Clara's hand, pressing the warm metal into her palm and closing her fingers around it. "I don't make promises I can't keep," Jack said, his voice low and raw. "My job is dangerous. I might not be back next week or next month." He paused, looking out at the river, then back at her. "But I will be back. I have a diner tab to settle, and I have a dog to pick up." Clara squeezed the tag, feeling the raised letters of his name against her skin. It was a piece of him, a promise made of steel. "I'll keep it safe," she whispered. "We'll be here. The Sentinels will be here." Jack nodded. He leaned down and placed a chaste kiss on her forehead, a gesture of respect and affection that meant more than anything else he could have done. Then he knelt one last time before Kaiser. "Watch her," he ordered softly. "Guard." Kaiser let out a single bark, a sharp sound of affirmation, and sat at perfect attention beside Clara. "Lieutenant Riley, on the bus," the driver called. Jack stood, squared his bag, and walked toward the bus. He didn't look back until he was on the steps. He turned, raising a hand in a silent salute. Clara raised hers in return, clutching the dog tag to her chest. The doors hissed shut. The bus pulled away, kicking up a small cloud of dust that was quickly carried off by the river breeze. Clara stood there for a long time, watching the taillights fade in the distance until they were swallowed by the horizon. The sun sank below the water, casting long shadows on the pavement. She wasn't alone. She felt the solid, reassuring weight of Kaiser leaning against her leg. She looked down at the dog and then at the tag in her hand. "Come on, buddy," she said softly, wiping a single tear from her cheek. "Let's go home. We've got work to do." She turned and walked back toward the lights of town, her step steady, her heart full, walking into a future that was finally her own.